The storm had arrived with the dusk, rolling across the moorlands in great sheets of grey that swallowed the last of the amber light, and now the rain lashed against the tall windows of Hartley Manor's library, with such fury that the ancient glass trembled in its leaded frames. Eleanor Ashford sat in the corner chair she had claimed as her own these 9 years past, her needlework abandoned in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the man who sat before the marble hearth as he had sat 1,000 evenings before, his profile illuminated by the dancing firelight in a way that still, after all this time, and stole the breath from her lungs. Lord William Hartley turned a page of his book, with long, elegant fingers, utterly unaware of her gaze, as he had been unaware for 9 years, 9 months, and 17 days, though Eleanor had long ago ceased counting the precise hours of her invisible devotion. The lamplight caught the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair at the temples, marks of time passing that she had witnessed in their gradual arrival, silent observer to the seasons of his life. She knew the way his brow furrowed when he read philosophy, the particular set of his shoulders when correspondence brought unwelcome news, and the rhythm of his breathing when he fell asleep in that very chair on winter nights, and she would slip away like a ghost, leaving him to his dreams. How many times had she memorized the line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the way shadows pooled in the hollow of his throat? How many times had she imagined speaking his given name aloud, not the formal "my lord" that propriety demanded, but William, just William, whispered in tones of tenderness. The wind howled through the chimneys, and somewhere in the house a shutter banged its lonely percussion, and Eleanor felt the weight of her secret love press against her ribs like a physical thing, heavy as stones, sweet as honey, terrible as any wound that bleeds in silence. She had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through his days like morning mist, arranging his world with hands he never noticed, loving him with a devotion he would never know, existing in the margins of his magnificent, unreachable life. But the decision had been made, sitting in this very chair 3 nights ago, while another storm raged, and he read another book, and she faced, at last, the truth she had been fleeing, that she could not bear another year of this exquisite torture, this beautiful, devastating proximity to everything she wanted and could never possess. She would leave at summer's end. The resolution sat in her chest like iron, cold and hard and necessary. 2 months remained to memorize every detail of him, to gather these last moments like flowers to be pressed between the pages of memory, and then Eleanor Ashford would disappear from Hartley Manor as quietly as she had existed within it, taking her 9-year vigil of silent love with her into whatever modest future awaited a woman of her reduced circumstances and broken heart. 9 years ago, Eleanor had arrived at Hartley Manor on an October afternoon, when the trees blazed with their dying glory and the air carried the first whisper of winter's approach, her trunk containing everything she owned in the world, her references clutched in trembling hands, her father's debts having stripped away her genteel upbringing and left her with nothing but her education and the desperate need for respectable employment as companion to Lady Catherine Hartley and the dowager aunt who resided in the East Wing and required someone to read to her, manage her correspondence, and provide the companionship that her nephew's infrequent visits could not supply. Eleanor had been shown to the morning room where Lady Catherine held court, and she had been answering questions about her abilities with French and needlework when the door opened and he entered, Lord William Hartley, master of the estate. And the world had seemed to tilt upon its axis in that moment, for even in her reduced circumstances, Eleanor retained enough sensibility to recognize masculine beauty when confronted with it. Though it was not merely his handsome features that arrested her, but something in his bearing, a quality of profound isolation that called to the loneliness in her own heart. He had greeted his aunt with cool affection, acknowledged Eleanor's introduction with a bow so correct it bordered on dismissive, his grey eyes passing over her as one might glance at a piece of furniture, and yet Eleanor had seen beneath that aristocratic reserve to the shadows that dwelt in those eyes, the careful control in every gesture, the walls built so high that surely he must be protecting something unbearably tender within. "You will find my nephew somewhat reserved, Miss Ashford," Lady Catherine had said after he departed, a note of sadness in her voice that Eleanor would come to understand only later, and Eleanor had murmured something appropriate while her heart performed strange acrobatics in her chest, for she had already begun the fatal process of falling in love with a man who had not truly seen her at all. Now, 9 years later, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her modest chamber, the resignation letter spread before her, the words she had labored over staring back at her in the lamplight. "Dear Lady Catherine, it is with sincere regret that I must tender my resignation as your companion, effective the 1st of August." The pen felt heavy in her hand, this instrument of her liberation, and as she signed her name with careful precision, Eleanor felt something break loose in her chest. Whether grief or relief, she could not say, only that the act of writing those words, of making her decision tangible and irrevocable, felt like dying and being born simultaneously, like closing a door on 9 years of beautiful torment and stepping into a future that held nothing but uncertainty and the cold comfort of self-preservation. The days at Hartley Manor followed their established pattern with the precision of a well-wound clock, and Eleanor moved through them as she had moved through 3,000 mornings before, arriving in the breakfast room before Lord William descended from his chambers, arranging the correspondence in neat stacks beside his place setting, ensuring the coffee was precisely as he preferred it, hot and black with no sugar, the newspaper ironed and folded to eliminate any unseemly creases that might disturb his morning routine. She poured his tea when he finally appeared at 8:30, her movements so practiced they had become almost meditative, the slight tilt of the porcelain pot, the amber liquid streaming into his cup, the small silver spoon placed just so on the saucer. And he accepted it without looking up from the letter he was reading, without a word of acknowledgement, for why should he notice what had always simply been there, arranged by invisible hands for his comfort and convenience? Eleanor took her own tea to the window seat, where the morning light fell across her needlework, close enough to be summoned if Lady Catherine required something, far enough to maintain the proper distance between a lord and a paid companion, and she watched him from beneath her lashes as he consumed his breakfast with the same controlled elegance he brought to every action, his posture impeccable, his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those grey eyes that never, ever turned in her direction. The steward arrived with questions about the tenant farms, and Eleanor observed how William's voice took on a particular quality when discussing matters of business, courteous but cool, efficient without warmth, and she thought, as she had thought 1,000 times before, that he spoke to everyone this way, that his isolation was not personal cruelty, but a fortress he had built around himself for reasons she could only guess at, though this knowledge brought no comfort to her hungry heart. Later, in the library where she had come to return Lady Catherine's books and select new volumes for the afternoon's reading, she found him standing before the shelves, searching for something, and when she approached to offer assistance, their hands reached simultaneously for the same leather-bound volume of Wordsworth, their fingers brushing for the briefest instant before both pulled back as if burned, and Eleanor felt that accidental touch reverberate through her entire body, like the ringing of a bell, while William merely stepped aside with a murmured, "Forgive me," and gestured for her to take the book, his face betraying nothing at all, though surely he must have felt something of what she felt, that spark of contact, that moment of connection. But no, his expression remained perfectly neutral as he turned away, selecting a different volume entirely, leaving Eleanor standing there with Wordsworth clutched to her chest and her heart, performing its familiar, futile gymnastics, loving him desperately in the silence between them, invisible as air, essential as breathing, unnoticed as the very walls that surrounded them both. It was Lady Catherine who first spoke of it, on an afternoon when Eleanor sat reading aloud from Miss Austen while the elderly woman worked at her embroidery, her gnarled fingers still remarkably steady with the needle, and during a pause in the narrative, Lady Catherine set down her work and said with unusual gravity, "My dear, you must understand that William was not always as he is now, so remote and carefully controlled, for there was a time when he laughed freely and loved with the whole of his generous heart, until Miss Lydia Pemberton accepted his offer of marriage, and then 3 months later ended their engagement to marry a viscount with a larger fortune, and something in him simply closed like a door slamming shut against a winter storm." Eleanor's hands trembled upon the book as compassion flooded through her alongside the pain of understanding, for now she knew why those grey eyes remained so carefully shuttered, why he kept the world at such a distance, and though this knowledge should have made her own suffering easier to bear, should have allowed her to see his indifference as not personal but universal, It somehow made everything worse, for now she could not even harbor the small, bitter comfort of feeling uniquely rejected, but must instead recognize that he saw no one at all, that his heart had been so thoroughly broken it could not risk the vulnerability of seeing. That evening there was a dinner party, for Lady Catherine still entertained despite her age and infirmity, and the drawing-room filled with the local gentry, among them 3 unmarried women of suitable age and fortune, who arranged themselves in William's vicinity like flowers, turning toward the sun, and Eleanor observed from her position near Lady Catherine's chair, fulfilling her role of fetching shawls and adjusting cushions, invisible as always, while Miss Thornton laughed too brightly at something. William said, while Miss Porter touched his sleeve with practiced coquetry, while the widow Mrs. Ashton engaged him in conversation about his travels abroad. Eleanor watched his face as he responded to each woman with the same mechanical courtesy, the same polite half-smile that never reached his eyes, and the same careful maintenance of proper distance even as they pressed closer, and she realized, with a sinking heart, that he performed these social rituals with the precision of an automaton, that behind the impeccable manners there was nothing, no spark of interest or possibility of connection, that he had sealed himself away so completely that even these beautiful, accomplished, eminently suitable women could not penetrate his fortress. And this observation brought Eleanor a strange mixture of relief and despair, for if he could not see them with all their obvious charms and determined pursuit, what hope had she ever possessed? She who existed in the margins of his life like a footnote he would never bother to read, and yet knowing that his blindness extended to everyone, somehow made her love him more rather than less, for she understood now that his isolation was not choice but survival, not cruelty, but the scar tissue that had formed over a wound too deep to heal. The weeks that followed passed with the strange quality of a dream from which one knows they must inevitably wake, and Eleanor moved through them in a state of heightened awareness, memorizing everything with the desperate attention of someone cataloguing treasures before a fire. For she had set summer's end as her departure, and though the date remained unspoken and unannounced, save in the letter, she kept folded in her writing desk. It pulled at her consciousness, like the tide pulling at the shore, inevitable and inexorable. She began the quiet work of separation, sorting through her modest possessions in the small hours after Lady Catherine had retired, folding away 9 years of accumulated belongings with hands that trembled only slightly, setting aside the worn books she had borrowed from the library and must return, the pressed flowers from gardens she would never walk again, the carefully mended gloves and shawls that had seen her through countless English winters in this house that had never quite become home, yet had somehow become everything. On a rainy afternoon in late spring, when the clouds hung low and heavy over the estate, and the portraits in the long gallery seemed to emerge from their frames with unusual vividness in the grey light, Eleanor found herself standing before the paintings of William's ancestors, studying the faces of Hartley's long dead, searching their painted eyes for some explanation of the living man who bore their features, trying to understand the lineage that had produced such carefully controlled isolation, such impenetrable reserve, and she wondered if any of these stern-faced lords had loved as she loved, silently and without hope, or if they had been the ones who inspired such devotion in others and remained oblivious to it. And as she stood there with rain drumming against the tall windows, she traced with her eyes the proud line of jaw that William had inherited from his grandfather, the particular set of the shoulders that appeared in generation after generation, the grey eyes that looked out from canvas after canvas with varying degrees of warmth or coldness, but always with that same essential quality of distance, of walls built high against the world. She was so absorbed in her examination of a portrait depicting William's great-grandmother, a woman with kind eyes who seemed to gaze at Eleanor with something like understanding, that she did not hear his footsteps on the marble floor until he spoke from directly behind her, his voice startling her so completely that she actually gasped and turned to find him standing closer than propriety dictated, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through the dark hair at his temples, and he said merely, "Miss Ashford, I did not mean to startle you." His tone formal as always, his expression revealing nothing, and she managed to reply with a composure she did not feel, "Not at all, my lord. I was merely admiring the portraits." And he glanced up at his great-grandmother's painted face and said, "She was said to be very kind, very gentle with those in her service, and Eleanor heard in these words some quality she could not name, some inflection that might have been meaningful or might have been her desperate imagination, finding significance where none existed, and they stood there together in the grey light with the rain falling and the eyes of his ancestors watching. And then he nodded once and moved away down the gallery, his footsteps echoing in the vast space, and after he had gone and she was alone again with the portraits and the rain, Eleanor reached out and touched the doorframe he had passed through, her fingers resting against the cool wood, a farewell to moments like these, to proximity without connection, to love without recognition, to 9 years of standing in the same rooms and occupying different worlds entirely. Lady Catherine's illness came suddenly in the night, a fever that burned through her frail body with alarming speed, and Eleanor was summoned from her bed at 3 in the morning to find the elderly woman barely conscious, her skin hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and labored, and without hesitation, Eleanor took command of the sick room with a quiet competence that surprised even herself, sending for the physician, ordering cool compresses, sitting beside the bed, through the dark hours before dawn, with Lady Catherine's papery hand clasped in her own, murmuring reassurances whether the old woman could hear them or not. The days that followed blurred into a continuous cycle of tending and watching, of spooning broth between cracked lips, of changing sweat-soaked linens, of reading aloud in a low voice from Lady Catherine's favourite poetry, when the fever broke enough for her to recognize Eleanor's presence. And through it all, Eleanor felt a fierce protective devotion toward this woman who had given her employment when she had nowhere else to turn, who had treated her with more kindness than her position strictly required, who had become in some ways the family Eleanor had lost when her father died and left her penniless and alone in the world. William came to the sick room each evening after dinner, standing in the doorway with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded that might have been fear or grief, or simply the terrible vulnerability of watching someone he loved slip away. And on the third night, when Eleanor had been awake for nearly 72 hours, sustained only by strong tea and the stubborn refusal to leave her post, William did not stand in the doorway but instead entered the room and took the chair opposite Eleanor's, across Lady Catherine's sleeping form, and they sat together in the lamplight, listening to the old woman's breathing, gradually grow steadier, stronger, returning from whatever dark place the fever had taken her. It was William who broke the silence, his voice low so as not to disturb his aunt's rest, saying, "You have been tireless in your devotion, Miss Ashford, and I find myself profoundly grateful for your care of her." And Eleanor looked up to find him watching her, with an expression she could not quite read, something almost like wonder mixed with confusion, as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time and did not quite understand what he was seeing, and she replied simply, "I love her very much, my lord. There is nothing I would not do for her comfort." And the truth of this statement hung in the air between them, and perhaps he heard in it the echo of other truths she could never speak, for his eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away and asked with studied casualness, "And when she recovers, what are your plans? Do you intend to remain in this household?" Eleanor's heart constricted painfully in her chest, but she managed to keep her voice steady as she answered, "I have been considering a change, my lord, perhaps seeking a position elsewhere." And she watched his hands tighten on the arms of his chair, watched his jaw clench almost imperceptibly, watched something that might have been distress flicker across his features before the familiar mask of composure settled back into place, and he said nothing more, merely nodded once and turned his attention back to his sleeping aunt. But the tension of all the words they had not spoken seemed to fill the room like smoke, choking and inescapable, and Eleanor knew with the particular clarity that comes in the deep hours of night that she could not remain much longer in this house, in this proximity to a man she loved who would never love her in return, that her departure had become not merely a decision but a necessity, a matter of survival. For how many more nights could she sit across from him like this, so close and yet impossibly distant, watching the lamplight play across his features, loving him with every fibre of her being, while he remained utterly, devastatingly unaware? Lady Catherine's recovery was gradual but complete, and by the time the first roses bloomed in the gardens, the old woman was sitting up in bed, demanding her correspondence and complaining about the bland food the physician had prescribed, which Eleanor took as a sure sign of returning health. And as May turned to June and the estate awakened fully into summer's green abundance, Eleanor knew the time had come to make formal what had been until now only a decision held privately in her heart. She chose a morning when William took breakfast alone, Lady Catherine still keeping to her rooms for the morning meal as part of her convalescence, and Eleanor entered the breakfast room with the letter she had written and rewritten a dozen times, her hands steady despite the wild beating of her heart, and she placed it beside his plate with a quiet, "My lord, I must give you this," and he looked up from his newspaper with that polite, distant expression she knew so well, and said, "What is this, Miss Ashford?" And she replied, her voice not betraying the cost of these words, "My formal notice of departure, sir. I shall be leaving your employment in 1 month's time." And she watched as he took the letter, watched as his eyes moved over the carefully composed lines, watched as something passed across his face too quickly to name, and then his hands, those elegant hands she had observed for 9 years, trembled almost imperceptibly, so that the newspaper he still held rustled faintly, and he set both letter and newspaper down with great care, stood abruptly, said only, "I see, thank you for the notice, Miss Ashford," and left the room so quickly it was nearly flight, leaving his breakfast untouched, his coffee cooling in its cup, and Eleanor stood there alone in the morning sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, and felt her heart break cleanly in two, for she had harbored some small, foolish hope that he might ask her to stay, he might show some sign that her departure mattered to him, but he had received the news with the same cool politeness with which he received all things, and the pain of it was so acute she could barely breathe. She fled to the gardens, to the rose garden specifically where she had walked so many mornings before the household stirred, and there among the blooms, heavy with dew and fragrance, she allowed herself to cry as she had not cried since her father's death, silent tears that fell onto the petals of pink and white and crimson roses, and she looked around at the beauty of the estate in full summer glory, at the ancient oaks casting dappled shade, at the stone fountain where birds came to drink, at the carefully tended beds of lavender and foxglove, at the winding paths she had walked in every season for 9 years, and she knew she was not merely leaving employment, but leaving the only home she had known in her adult life, leaving the man she loved with a devotion that had become woven into the fabric of her being, leaving behind everything that mattered while taking with her only memories and the terrible, liberating knowledge that she had finally found the courage to choose survival over silent suffering. And as she stood there with tears on her cheeks and the scent of roses all around her, she whispered to the morning air, "Goodbye, William. Goodbye to all of this, and goodbye to love that was never returned. Goodbye to hope." And the roses nodded in the gentle breeze, as though they understood, as though they had witnessed all these years of quiet devotion and quiet heartbreak. And Eleanor wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders and walked back toward the house, toward the remaining month of service, toward the inevitable morning when she would leave Hartley Hall forever. William stood in the breakfast room long after Eleanor had gone, staring at the letter she had left beside his untouched plate, and something inside him that had been carefully controlled for years began to crack and splinter in ways he did not understand, and he found himself unable to remain in that sun-filled room with its cheerful morning light and the mockery of normal routine. So he walked, striding through the halls of Hartley Hall without destination or purpose, driven by a restlessness that felt dangerously close to panic, and everywhere he turned, he saw evidence of Eleanor's presence in ways he had never consciously noticed before, but which now struck him with the force of revelation. In the library there was a book lying open on the small table by the window, a volume of poetry he recognized as one she often read in the quiet hours before dinner, and he found himself picking it up, running his fingers over the pages she had touched, reading the lines she had been reading, and the intimacy of this simple act made his hands tremble. On the chair in the morning room lay her shawl, the soft grey one she wore when the mornings were cool, and he stood looking at it as though it were some artifact from a vanished civilization, something precious and inexplicable, and he realized with a shock that he knew this shawl, knew the exact shade of grey, knew the way she drew it around her shoulders, knew without ever having consciously observed these details, and how was that possible unless he had been watching her all along without realizing it? In the entrance hall stood a vase of flowers, white roses and lavender arranged with simple elegance, and he knew without being told that Eleanor had arranged them, had walked in the garden early this morning, before anyone else stirred, and gathered these blooms, and placed them here, and they would wilt and die, and she would not be here to replace them, and the thought of this ordinary absence struck him as unbearable. He walked faster, as though he could outpace the realization building inside him, climbed the stairs to the portrait gallery, stood before the painting of his grandfather, and tried to summon the familiar comfort of family history, of lineage and duty, and the orderly progression of generations. But all he could think was that Eleanor had stood in this very spot just weeks ago, had gazed at these same portraits, and what had she been thinking, what had she been feeling, and why had he never asked, never wondered, never seen her as anything more than a quiet presence at the periphery of his life? He told himself it was merely habit, this disturbance at her impending departure, that any disruption to established routine would naturally cause some degree of discomfort, and that he had grown accustomed to her efficiency, her competence, her unobtrusive management of household details. And that was all this feeling was, simple resistance to change, nothing more. But even as he formed these rational explanations, he knew them for the lies they were. For the truth was rising up through all his carefully constructed defenses like water through cracks in a dam. The truth that somewhere in the course of 9 years Eleanor Ashford had become essential to him in ways he had refused to acknowledge, that her quiet presence had been not merely pleasant but necessary, that she had understood his moods without his speaking them, had anticipated his needs, had created around him an atmosphere of such gentle understanding that he had moved through his days, cushioned by her care without ever recognizing it as care, as devotion, as love. And God help him, what had he done? How had he been so blind? How had he failed to see what was right before him all this time? And the memories came flooding back now with terrible clarity, the small moments he had dismissed or forgotten, the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching, the way her voice softened when she read to his aunt, the way she had sat with him through his aunt's illness, asking nothing for herself, giving everything, and he pressed his palms against his eyes as though he could stop the visions, but they kept coming. 9 years of moments, 9 years of her silent presence, 9 years of loving him while he remained locked away in his fortress of grief and fear, and the cruelty of it, the waste of it, the terrible, devastating waste of it. And he knew with sudden, crushing certainty that if Eleanor left, he would lose something he had not even known he possessed, something more precious than all the accumulated wealth and history of Hartley Hall. He would lose the one person who had seen him truly and loved him anyway, and the knowledge of what he stood to lose made him feel as though the ground beneath his feet had turned to water. 3 weeks remained, and Eleanor marked each day with a quiet resignation that felt both liberating and devastating, and continuing her duties with the same careful efficiency she had always shown, while inside her heart slowly prepared itself for the amputation of leaving. And she did not expect the change that came over William's behavior, the strange new pattern that emerged in those weeks like some shift in the very architecture of her days. He began appearing in places he had never frequented before, places that had been her private refuges within the vast estate, and the first time she encountered him in the library on a Wednesday afternoon, when he never came to the library on Wednesday afternoons, she startled visibly, and he offered some stilted explanation about searching for a particular volume on estate management, though the book he eventually selected was a collection of poetry, and 2 days later he was in the morning room at the precise hour when she always took her tea there alone, and he claimed he had come for the better light to read his correspondence, though the study had perfectly adequate light, and he knew it. And then she found him in the rose garden on a Sunday morning, standing among the blooms with his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of studied casualness that fooled neither of them. And when he saw her, he did not retreat as she expected, but instead walked toward her and said, "The roses are particularly fine this year, Miss Ashford." And she replied, "Yes, my lord, and they are." And they stood there in excruciating silence, while bees hummed among the flowers and the morning sun grew warmer, and he seemed to be struggling to say something more, his jaw working, his eyes not quite meeting hers, and finally he asked, "Are you quite certain of your decision to leave?" And the question, delivered in a tone that tried for indifference and failed, made her heart clench painfully, but she could not tell him the truth, could not lay bare 9 years of love before him like some desperate supplicant. So she said only, "Yes, my lord, quite certain." "It is time for a change." And she watched something flash across his face that might have been pain or frustration or anger. She could not tell which. And he said, "A change," as though testing the word, finding it inadequate. "And where will you go? What will you do?" And she replied, "I have a position waiting with a family in Hampshire, my lord, a widow who requires a companion," which was not entirely true. The position was not yet confirmed, but likely, and his hands clenched at his sides, and he said, "I see. Hampshire, quite far then," and she said, "Yes, my lord," and the air between them felt charged with everything they were not saying, with 9 years of unspoken words pressing against the boundaries of proper discourse, and he opened his mouth as though to say something more, something real perhaps, but then closed it again, and merely nodded curtly and said, "I hope you will be very happy there, Miss Ashford," and walked away with rigid shoulders, leaving her standing among the roses with tears threatening and confusion warring with hurt. For what did he want from her? Why was he suddenly everywhere she turned? Why did he ask questions as though her answers mattered when he had never cared before, and she could not make sense of it, could not allow herself to hope that it meant anything beyond perhaps a master's habitual resistance to change in his household, and so she steeled herself and continued counting down the days, 19 now, then 18, then 17, while William continued his strange campaign of proximity, appearing at breakfast when he usually took it in his study, lingering in halls where she passed, and always those stilted attempts at conversation that went nowhere because she could not bear to reveal her heart, and he seemed unable to speak whatever was truly on his mind, and the frustration built between them like a gathering storm, and Eleanor began to feel as though she were being slowly torn apart, for leaving would be agony. But staying in this new torment of his inexplicable attention was perhaps worse, and she prayed for strength to endure these final weeks, to maintain her composure and to leave with dignity and tact, even as her heart shattered into smaller and smaller pieces. 2 weeks remained, and Lady Catherine Hartley, recovered now from her illness but not from her powers of observation, summoned her nephew to her private sitting room on a grey afternoon when rain threatened, but had not yet fallen. And William came reluctantly, sensing perhaps that this conversation would not be the gentle inquiry about her health he might have preferred. And indeed, his aunt wasted no time on pleasantries, but looked at him with those sharp eyes that age had not dimmed, and said, "Sit down, William, we must speak plainly." And he sat, feeling suddenly like a boy called to account for some misdeed, and she folded her hands in her lap and said, "You are about to make the gravest mistake of your life." And he stiffened and said, "I do not know what you mean, aunt," though of course he knew exactly what she meant, and she made a sound of impatience and replied, "Do not insult my intelligence with denials. You know perfectly well I speak of Eleanor, of your blindness, of your cowardice." And the words struck him like blows. Cowardice, and he wanted to protest but found he could not, for was it not cowardice that had kept him locked away from feeling for so long? And his aunt continued, her voice gentler now but no less pointed, "I have watched that girl love you for 9 years, William, 9 years of silent devotion, and I have watched you fail to see what was before your eyes. And now that she has found the courage to leave, to spare herself further pain, you wander the halls like a ghost, appearing in her path, asking meaningless questions, and still you do not speak the truth, still you do not act. And I must ask you, my dear boy, are you truly living or are you merely existing? Are you honoring Catherine's memory by this self-imposed isolation, or are you betraying the very capacity for love that made you worthy of her in the first place?" And the mention of his former betrothed, dead these 10 years, made William flinch, for he had not spoken her name aloud in so long, had carried her memory like a talisman against further pain, and his aunt saw the flinch and pressed her advantage, saying, "Catherine loved life, William. She loved fully and without fear, and she would be devastated to see what you have become, this hollow man who moves through days without truly living them. And now Eleanor, dear Eleanor, who has asked nothing, who has given everything, who has loved you with a patience and grace that humbles me, now she is leaving because you cannot find the courage to open your heart. And I tell you plainly that if you let her go, you will regret it for the rest of your days. You will look back on this moment and know that you chose fear over love, chose safety over life, and you will die alone in this great house, surrounded by your precious control and your carefully maintained distance from all human feeling. And is that truly what you want? And William sat there, feeling as though she had reached into his chest and pulled out his heart and held it up for examination. And he found he could not speak, could not defend himself, for everything she said was true. And she leaned forward and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for one so recently ill, and said more softly, "I am old, William, and I have seen much of life, and I tell you that love, true love, comes rarely, and when it comes we must have the courage to receive it, to honor it, to return it, even if doing so terrifies us, even if we have been hurt before, even if every instinct screams at us to protect ourselves, for a life without love is no life at all. It is merely a long dying, and Eleanor loves you, has loved you faithfully and without hope of return. And you, my dear boy, whether you have admitted it to yourself or not, you love her too. I have seen it in the way you watch her when you think no one observes, in the way you have come undone these past weeks at the thought of losing her. And the question is not whether you love her, but whether you have the courage to acknowledge it, to speak it, to risk your heart again." And she released his hand and sat back and said, "2 weeks, William, that is all the time you have. 2 weeks to decide whether you will live or merely exist. 2 weeks to find your courage or lose everything that matters." And then she dismissed him, and William left her sitting room and walked out into the grounds as the first drops of rain began to fall. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to examine his feelings honestly, stripping away all the careful rationalizations and defenses. And what he found beneath terrified him, for his aunt was right, and he loved Eleanor, had perhaps been loving her slowly and quietly for years without recognizing it. And the thought of speaking this truth, of making himself vulnerable again, of risking the devastation he had felt when Catherine died, it made him want to retreat back into his fortress of control. But he thought of Eleanor leaving, of never seeing her again, of spending the rest of his life in this hollow existence his aunt had so accurately described. And he knew he had to choose, had to find within himself whatever courage remained. And standing there in the rain, he felt something shift inside him, some long frozen part of his heart beginning to crack and thaw, and he knew that whatever fear he felt, whatever risk loving entailed, it was nothing compared to the certainty of loss if he let Eleanor walk away. 1 week remained, 7 days that stretched before Eleanor like a bridge she must cross into an unknown country, and she began the ritual of packing her trunk, that most intimate of farewells, each item she folded and placed in the worn leather case, a memory she was deliberately consigning to the past. And there was the grey shawl she had worn on that October afternoon 3 years ago, when unexpected rain had caught her in the garden, and William had appeared with an umbrella, walking her back to the house in silence, but staying close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat and feel the warmth radiating from his presence. And she held the shawl against her face now, breathing in the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she kept in her wardrobe, and then folded it carefully and laid it in the trunk. And there was the slim volume of Wordsworth that he had handed to her one winter morning, saying only, "I thought you might enjoy this, Miss Ashford," the first and only book he had ever given her directly, and she had treasured it beyond reason, had read it until she could recite whole passages from memory, and she traced the worn cover with her fingertips before placing it atop the shawl, and there between the pages of her journal she found the pressed rose from the garden, taken on a June morning 2 years past, when the world had seemed almost unbearably beautiful, and her heart had been so full of unspoken love that she thought it might burst, and the rose was brittle now. Its color faded to a ghostly pink, but she remembered the exact bush it had come from, remembered the way the dew had sparkled on its petals, remembered standing there alone thinking this is enough, to love him is enough, even if he never knows, and she tucked the pressed flower carefully into a small wooden box, lined with velvet, and placed that in the trunk as well. While outside her window, though she did not know it, William stood in his study, watching her move through the garden on one of her final walks through the grounds she had come to love, and he was memorizing everything about her, the way she paused to touch the bark of the old oak tree, the way she bent to examine a late-blooming rose, the particular grace of her movements, the tilt of her head when something caught her attention, and inside his chest, his heart was performing calculations of loss, measuring all the days ahead, without her presence, without her quiet competence, without the particular quality of peace she brought to rooms simply by being in them, and the realization that had been building since his aunt's devastating honesty 3 days ago finally crystallized into absolute certainty. He loved her, loved Eleanor Ashford, who had been invisible to him for 9 years while being simultaneously essential to every day. Loved her with a depth that terrified him because he had not chosen it, had not prepared for it, had not built any defenses against it. And he understood now that perhaps he had been loving her slowly and quietly for years, that his heart had been making its own decisions while his conscious mind remained locked in old grief and older fear. And the terror of this realization warred with something else, something that felt almost like wonder, for even in his fear he recognized that this love, this quiet, steady love that had grown in darkness without his tending, was different from anything he had known before. It was patient, where his youthful passion had been urgent, was deep, where his previous love had been bright, was rooted in years of observation and unconscious intimacy, in 1,000 small moments of proximity and understanding. And he did not know what to do with this knowledge, did not know how to speak it after so many years of silence, did not know if he had any right to speak it now, when she had made her decision to leave, when she had clearly accepted that he would never see her, and the fear that she might reject him, might tell him that whatever love she had once felt had been exhausted by 9 years of invisibility. This fear paralyzed him, even as another fear, greater still, whispered that if he did not speak, he would lose her forever, would spend the rest of his life in the hollow existence his aunt had described. And so he stood at his window watching Eleanor in the garden, memorizing her, loving her, terrified of her. 7 days remaining, and every one of them heavy with the weight of words he did not know how to say. 3 days remained, 72 hours that stretched before William like an eternity, and yet rushed toward him with terrible speed. And in those 3 days he discovered that knowing one loves and finding the courage to speak that love are two entirely different things. For each time he resolved to go to Eleanor, to tell her everything, fear rose up in him like a physical force, whispering its catalogue of disasters. What if she refused him? What if 9 years of silence had killed whatever feeling she might once have held? What if he spoke and saw pity in her eyes rather than love? What if opening his heart again only invited the devastating pain he had spent a decade avoiding? And so he remained paralyzed, watching the hours slip away, hating himself for his cowardice yet unable to overcome it, while Eleanor, believing herself utterly forgotten in these final days, found to her surprise a strange peace settling over her, and for the decision was made. The trunk was packed. The future, however uncertain, was at least different from this long ache of loving without hope, and she moved through the estate with a kind of calm melancholy, saying goodbye to rooms and hallways and views from windows, storing up memories she would carry into whatever life awaited her beyond these walls. And on the evening of the third to last day, Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, organized a farewell dinner for Eleanor, gathering the household staff in the servants' hall, where they had laid out the good china and prepared Eleanor's favorite dishes, and the upper servants made speeches praising her kindness and competence, and the maids she had befriended wept openly, and even stern Mr. Davies the butler seemed moved as he raised his glass and said, "To Miss Ashford, who has graced this household with her presence and her goodness, may she find every happiness in her new situation." And everyone drank, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion at this unexpected tribute, at the realization that she had been seen after all, if not by the one person whose recognition she craved, then at least by these good people who had worked alongside her for 9 years. And Lady Catherine had insisted that Eleanor dine with the family that final evening, and so she found herself at the long table in the formal dining room, wearing her best dress, which was nevertheless plain beside the aunt's elegant attire. And William was there, silent and pale, his evening clothes immaculate as always, but something dishevelled about his eyes, and he did not eat, though servants placed course after course before him. He did not drink, though his wine glass was filled and refilled, and his eyes followed Eleanor with an intensity that would have been remarked upon had anyone been paying attention. But Lady Catherine was determinedly cheerful, telling stories of Eleanor's years of service, of her patience and wisdom, of how the household would never be the same without her. And Eleanor smiled and murmured appropriate responses, while William sat frozen, watching her, memorizing the way candlelight caught in her dark hair, the gentle curve of her cheek, the graceful movement of her hands. Knowing he was losing her, and still unable to find words, And Lady Catherine noticed, of course, noticed her nephew's agony and Eleanor's carefully maintained composure, and she smiled to herself, thinking that perhaps tragedy might yet be averted if William could find his courage, though time was running desperately short. And when dinner ended and Eleanor rose to retire, pleading the need to finish her preparations, William half rose from his chair as if to follow, then sank back down, his hands gripping the table edge, and Lady Catherine watched him with a mixture of exasperation and sympathy, for she could lead him to the truth, but she could not make him speak it, that he would have to find within himself. And Eleanor walked slowly up the grand staircase to her small room, unaware that below in the dining room, William sat with his head in his hands, while his aunt said quietly, "3 days, my dear boy, only 3 days, and then it will be too late." And he whispered, "I know." But still he did not move. Still fear held him frozen, and the clock in the hall chimed 10, and the house settled into night, and opportunity slipped away like water through desperate fingers. The final day arrived with that peculiar quality of unreality that accompanies all irrevocable endings, and Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of the stable boys loading her trunks onto the carriage, the thuds and scrapes of leather against wood marking the dismantling of her life in this place. And she lay in her narrow bed in the small room that had been hers for 9 years, watching the grey light strengthen beyond the window, knowing that in a few hours she would leave this house forever, would pass through its doors as a stranger passes, no longer belonging to the rhythms and routines that had shaped her days, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. But she rose because there was nothing else to do, dressed in her travelling clothes, the dark blue dress and matching spencer she had worn when she first arrived 9 years ago, finding a strange symmetry in this. And then she began her farewell rounds of the house, moving through rooms that were still shadowed in early morning dimness, touching the walls as though she might absorb them through her fingertips, breathing in the particular scent of each space, the library with its smell of old leather and wood smoke, the morning room with its faint perfume of the roses she had arranged just yesterday, a long gallery with its scent of beeswax and thyme, and she walked slowly, reverently, saying goodbye to the inanimate witnesses of her secret devotion, the chairs where she had sat, the windows through which she had watched the seasons change, the floors she had crossed countless times carrying books or tea or letters, and finally she came to the library, and that room above all others, where she had spent so many evenings in William's unconscious company, and she stood in the doorway looking at his chair by the hearth, the small table where he kept his current reading, the lamp that cast such beautiful light across his features when he read, and she allowed herself to fully feel the loss of this, the end of watching him, the end of these quiet hours of proximity that had been both her joy and her torment. And then she walked to his desk, that massive mahogany piece that dominated one corner of the room, and from the pocket of her spencer she drew out a single white rose, cut from the garden just after dawn, its petals still holding drops of dew, and she placed it carefully on the center of his desk blotter, this one small declaration that she would never have the courage to make in words, this symbol of everything she had felt and never spoken, 9 years of devotion condensed into the fragile beauty of a flower, and she stood looking at it for a long moment, this rose that would tell him nothing he wanted to know, but everything she needed to say. And then she turned and walked from the library without looking back, climbed the stairs to her room to collect her reticule and gloves, her heart beating with a strange mixture of grief and resolution, for she was leaving, but she was also, finally, speaking, even if only in the language of flowers, even if he would likely never understand what the rose meant. And as she descended the servants' stairs for the last time, the house was beginning to wake around her, and she thought that this was right, to leave in this liminal hour between night and day, between the life she had known and the life she must now discover, and she did not know that upstairs William still slept restlessly, that he had lain awake until nearly dawn, wrestling with his demons, before finally succumbing to exhausted sleep, that he would wake to find her gone, and she did not know about the rose waiting on his desk, its thorns removed, its stem cut at an angle, its whiteness pure against the dark wood, a final message from a heart that had loved in silence for so long that silence had become its native tongue. William woke with a start to pale morning light and the terrible knowledge that he had overslept, that the final hours were slipping away while he lay paralyzed by dreams and indecision, and he rose hastily, dressing with trembling hands, his heart already racing with a nameless dread, and something pulled him toward the library, some instinct or intuition. And when he entered that familiar room, the morning sun was streaming through the tall windows, illuminating his desk, and there upon the dark wood lay a single white rose, perfect and pristine, its petals luminous in the light, and William stopped as though struck, staring at this impossible thing, this flower that had not been there when he retired last night, and slowly, almost fearfully, he approached the desk, reached out to touch the rose with fingers that shook, and lifted it, and felt the smoothness of the stem where thorns had been carefully removed, saw the precise angle of the cut that spoke of deliberate intent, and understanding crashed over him like a wave, drowning him in the suddenly obvious truth. For Eleanor loved roses, tended them in the garden, arranged them in vases throughout the house, and she would leave a rose, would speak in this silent language, because silence had been her only vocabulary for 9 years, and the white rose meant purity, devotion, reverence, meant everything she had never been able to say in words, meant that she had loved him, perhaps loved him still, and he had been so blind, so determinedly unseeing, and the full weight of what he was losing struck him with physical force. 9 years of her quiet presence, her gentle competence, her patient devotion that he had taken for granted, as one takes for granted the air one breathes, and panic seized him, the terrible certainty that it was too late, that she was already gone, and he turned and ran from the library. The rose still clutched in his hand, ran through the halls with his composure utterly shattered, calling for Davies, for Mrs. Winters, for anyone who might tell him whether Eleanor had departed, and he burst into the entrance hall just as the great clock was chiming 8, and there in the drive beyond the open doors he could see the carriage, her trunks already secured, the horses stamping and ready, and his heart stopped, simply stopped beating for one terrible moment, and then he heard footsteps on the grand staircase, that familiar light tread he had heard 10,000 times without truly hearing, and he turned and saw her descending. Eleanor Ashford in her dark blue travelling dress, her bonnet in her hand, her face composed but pale, so pale, and their eyes met across the expanse of black and white marble floor, and the world seemed to suspend itself, time stretching and bending, and William saw everything in that moment, saw the 9 years reflected in her eyes, the love and the longing and the resignation, saw the woman who had stood in the shadows of his life, holding her devotion like a candle in the darkness, and something in him broke, some final wall or barrier, and his composure, which he had maintained for a decade, crumbled visibly, his face transforming from the cool aristocratic mask he wore to something raw and desperate and utterly vulnerable, and Eleanor stopped halfway down the stairs, frozen by the expression on his face, by the white rose he held in his hand like an accusation or a plea, and between them the morning light fell in shafts through the high windows, and the household staff had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion, witnessing this moment of transformation, and William took a step toward the stairs, then another, the rose trembling in his grip, and he opened his mouth, but no words came. For how does one speak after 9 years of silence? How does one say in a single moment what should have been said across 1,000 days? And Eleanor stood perfectly still, her hand on the banister, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching this man she loved unravel before her eyes, seeing something she had never dared hope to see, and the space between them thrummed with possibility and terror, and the weight of everything unspoken. The word escaped William's lips as barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the marble expanse with the force of a thunderclap. Wait, and Eleanor froze on the stairs as though the single syllable had turned her to stone, her hand gripping the banister until her knuckles whitened, and around them the household staff had gathered in doorways and alcoves. Mrs. Winters with her hand pressed to her mouth, Davies standing rigid by the entrance, the parlour maids clutching their dusting cloths, all witnesses to this moment of shattering propriety, and William moved toward the stairs with none of his usual measured grace, his movements almost stumbling in their urgency, the white rose still clutched in his hand. And propriety be damned, dignity be damned, everything be damned, except the terrible necessity of stopping her from walking out that door. And he reached the bottom of the grand staircase and looked up at her, and Eleanor saw in his face such naked emotion that her breath caught in her throat, saw the walls he had built so carefully over the years crumbling like ancient fortifications before a siege, and he climbed the stairs toward her, 2 steps, 3, until he stood just below where she stood frozen, and their eyes were nearly level, and she could see the fine tremor in his hands and the wild desperation in his grey eyes that she had never seen in all their 9 years of careful distance. And he spoke again, his voice rough and breaking, stripped of every artifice. "Don't leave." And those 2 words contained such raw pleading that Eleanor felt her own careful composure beginning to fracture, felt the tears she had sworn not to shed burning behind her eyes, and disbelief warred with hope, warred with fear on her face, for this could not be happening. William Hartley did not break, did not plead, did not look at her with such devastating vulnerability, and yet here he stood, his chest heaving as though he had run miles instead of merely across a hall, and he lifted the rose between them, that white symbol of her secret devotion, and his voice cracked as he said, "I have been blind, Eleanor, so blind, and but the words seemed to fail him, choked by emotion or fear, or the sheer impossibility of saying in moments what should have been said across years, and he tried again, "Forgive me," and it was barely a whisper, barely audible, but Eleanor heard it as clearly as if he had shouted, heard the desperation and the sorrow and the plea contained in those 2 words, and the tears she had been holding back began to fall, tracing silent paths down her pale cheeks, and the 9 years stretched between them, heavy with all the moments of watching and waiting and loving in silence, in all the evenings in the library, when she had sat invisible while her heart broke quietly, all the mornings when she had poured his tea with hands that longed to touch him, all the nights when she had lain awake, knowing he would never see her. And now he stood before her, seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, and the weight of it was almost unbearable, and below them the staff watched in breathless silence, and the morning light continued to stream through the high windows, and somewhere in the drive the carriage horses stamped impatiently, and Eleanor opened her mouth to speak but found herself as wordless as he, found that 9 years of silence could not be broken easily, even when everything depended on breaking it. And William took another step closer, close enough that she could see the silver beginning at his temples, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, every detail of the face she had memorized in stolen glances, and he extended the rose toward her with a hand that trembled visibly, offering back to her the symbol of everything she had tried to say in leaving it, and his voice when he spoke again was raw with emotion. "Please, Eleanor, please do not go." The library doors closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal them away from the world, and Eleanor stood trembling in the center of that familiar room, while William moved to the windows, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and the silence stretched between them until he finally spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I was engaged once, years before you came to this house, to a woman I believed I loved, and she accepted me for my title, for the estate, for everything except the man I was, and when she discovered I had lost a significant portion of my fortune in a failed investment, she ended our engagement publicly, cruelly, and I swore then that I would never make myself vulnerable again, and never allow anyone close enough to wound me as she had wounded me." And he turned to face Eleanor, his grey eyes haunted. "And I built walls, Eleanor, such high walls that I could not see over them, could not see you standing in the shadows of my self-imposed isolation, and for 9 years you have been here, constant and gentle and patient, and I took your presence for granted, as one takes for granted the sun rising, never questioning, never acknowledging, until yesterday when Aunt Catherine told me you were leaving and something shifted in me, some terrible recognition that the fabric of my days was woven through with you, with your quiet competence and your gentle smile and the way you understood my moods without requiring explanations. And I tried to tell myself it was merely habit, merely the comfort of familiar routine. But last night I could not sleep for thinking of this house without you in it, of mornings without your presence in the breakfast room, of evenings without hearing your footsteps in the hall. And this morning I found the rose you left, and I understood, finally understood what I had been too afraid to see, and his voice broke slightly, that you loved me, perhaps have loved me, and I have wasted 9 years in cowardice and blindness." Eleanor listened with tears streaming freely down her face, her hands clasped tightly before her, and when he fell silent, she drew a shaking breath and spoke the truth she had guarded for so long. I have loved you for 9 years, my lord, from the first month I came to this house. When you found me in the garden, after I had received news of my father's death, and you sat with me in silence while I wept, asking nothing, offering only presents, and in that moment I saw beneath your reserve to the man you kept hidden, and I loved that man, have loved him through every season that has passed, through every morning and evening, through every moment of invisible service, and I stayed though it broke my heart daily, because being near you, even unseen, was better than being anywhere else in the world. But I could not stay forever. William, I could not watch you from the shadows for the rest of my life, could not continue to love you in silence when that love was consuming me, and saying his name. Speaking it aloud for the first time without his title felt like shattering glass, like breaking free of chains. And William crossed the room to her in 3 swift strides, and his hand reached for hers, trembling as it touched her fingers, and at that first deliberate contact both of them drew sharp breaths, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, and his voice was barely a whisper as he said, 9 years I have wasted, 9 years you have suffered in silence, and I cannot restore that time, cannot undo the loneliness I inflicted through my blindness. But Eleanor, if you can forgive me, if you can give me a chance to know you truly, to see you as I should have seen you always, I swear I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the devotion you have shown me. And Eleanor's walls crumbled completely as she looked into his eyes and saw there everything she had dreamed of seeing, love and longing, and the terrified hope of a man learning to be vulnerable again. Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest, some dam that had held back 9 years of carefully contained emotion, and the tears came freely now. But they were different from the tears she had shed in lonely darkness. These were tears of release, of joy mingled with sorrow, of everything she had held silent finally given voice. And William pulled her closer, his arms encircling her with a tenderness that made her tremble, and she felt his own tears fall against her hair as he held her. This proud man who had hidden behind walls for so long now, allowing himself to break in her presence, and they stood there in the library, where she had watched him for countless evenings. But now they held each other as years of restraint dissolved between them, and when Eleanor pulled back slightly to look at his face, she saw wonder there, and fear, and love so raw and new that it made her breath catch, and she found herself laughing through her tears, laughing at the impossibility of this moment, at the joy of being seen after so long invisible. And William laughed too, a sound she had never heard from him, rough and unpracticed but genuine, and he lifted his hand to her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with such gentleness that fresh ones fell, and he whispered, I am sorry, Eleanor, so deeply sorry for every moment you suffered in silence, for every evening you sat unacknowledged, for every kindness I accepted without seeing the love behind it, for 9 years of blindness when you deserved to be seen, to be cherished. And Eleanor shook her head, her hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. You were hurt, William. You were protecting yourself, and I understood that even as it broke my heart, I understood. And he pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as though memorizing her. And outside the storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke, rain lashing against the windows in torrents that matched the emotional tempest within. And William drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that made her dizzy, and he said, May I kiss you, Eleanor? May I finally, properly, show you what I should have shown you long ago? And she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion choking her, and he lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away, though she would not have pulled away for anything in the world. And when his lips finally touched hers, it was tentative at first, gentle, almost reverent, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how to be tender, learning tenderness again. But then Eleanor's hands slid into his hair, and she pressed closer, and the kiss deepened, 9 years of longing pouring into it, 9 years of watching and wanting and loving in silence now given full expression. And William made a sound low in his throat and pulled her tighter against him, and the kiss became something desperate and beautiful, years of restraint burning away in the fire of their connection. And when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and William whispered against her lips, I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I love you, and I will spend every day proving it. I swear this to you. And Eleanor whispered back, I believe you, William, I believe you. and the transformation had begun, the walls crumbling, the silence broken, two lonely souls finding in each other the home they had been seeking all along. 3 days passed in a haze of wonder and tentative joy, 3 days during which William and Eleanor navigated the strange new territory of acknowledged love, and on the 4th day, William made the formal announcement to the household staff, assembled in the great hall, his voice steady, but his hand trembling slightly as it held Eleanor's. "Miss Ashford has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage, and I trust you will join me in celebrating our engagement." And the room erupted in applause and exclamations of joy, for the servants had witnessed Eleanor's 9 years of quiet devotion and William's recent transformation, and Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, openly wept with happiness, while the butler, Mr. Graves, allowed himself a rare smile, and Aunt Catherine, seated in her favorite chair with a shawl around her shoulders, looked upon them with such satisfaction that Eleanor had to laugh through her own tears, knowing the old woman had orchestrated much of this resolution through her pointed conversation with William. And that evening there was a celebratory dinner where toasts were raised, and William kept Eleanor's hand in his throughout the meal, no longer caring for propriety or reserve, and later they walked in the gardens as twilight fell, the roses heavy with summer blooms, and William stopped beneath the arbor, where wisteria hung in purple cascades, and turned to Eleanor, cupping her face in his hands. "I still cannot believe you are here, that you have forgiven me, that you are mine." And Eleanor smiled, reaching up to cover his hands with her own. "I have always been yours, William, from the beginning. I simply waited for you to see it." And they walked on, speaking of their future, of the wedding they would plan for autumn when the estate was most beautiful, of the life they would build together, and Eleanor marveled at the transformation in William, how his face had softened, how his eyes now met hers with an openness that would have been unthinkable weeks before, how he reached for her constantly, as though reassuring himself of her presence. And when they paused by the fountain where water cascaded over stone worn smooth by centuries, William drew her close and kissed her forehead, her temples, her lips, with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and wonder, and Eleanor felt herself bloom under his attention like the roses bloomed under summer sun. And she understood that this was not merely happiness but transformation, that they were both becoming something new through their union, something neither could have been alone. And as they returned to the house hand in hand, the windows glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness, Eleanor looked up at the familiar facade and felt no longer like a ghost haunting the periphery, but like someone coming home, truly home, and William squeezed her hand as though reading her thoughts, and whispered, "Welcome home, my love, welcome home at last." 5 years had passed since that storm-torn day when Eleanor's departure had shattered William's carefully constructed walls. 5 years, during which the estate had been transformed from a place of shadows and silence into a home filled with warmth and life. And now Eleanor stood in the library on another autumn evening, rain pattering against the windows in gentle rhythm. But she was no longer the invisible companion watching from the periphery. She was Lady Hartley, mistress of the estate, beloved wife, a mother to 2 children, whose laughter echoed through halls that had once known only hushed voices and restrained footsteps. And as she gazed around the familiar room, she marveled at how everything had changed, and yet remained the same. The leather chairs still flanked the fireplace where flames danced and crackled. The shelves still held their ancient volumes, but now children's books were scattered on the low table. Now her embroidery rested on the ottoman. Now the room bore the marks of a family rather than a solitary man's retreat, and she heard footsteps in the corridor and turned. As William entered, their daughter Catherine perched on his shoulders with her small hands tangled in his hair, and their son James toddling beside him clutching his father's hand, and Eleanor's heart swelled with a joy so complete it brought tears to her eyes, even after 5 years of such moments, for she had never imagined this abundance of happiness, never dared to dream that her silent love would be answered with such devotion. And William's face, when he saw her, softened into the expression she knew was reserved for her alone, the expression that still made her breath catch even after years of marriage. And he lifted Catherine down gently and sent both children to their nursemaid who waited in the doorway. And when they were alone, he crossed to Eleanor and drew her into his arms without a word, simply holding her as the rain fell outside and the fire warmed the room, and Eleanor rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart. and felt the peace that came from being completely known and completely loved. And William kissed the top of her head and murmured, "I was thinking today of the first time I truly saw you, and how close I came to losing you forever." And Eleanor pulled back to look at him, seeing in his eyes the memory of that desperate moment on the stairs, and she touched his face gently. "But you did not lose me, William. You found the courage to speak, and I found the courage to stay." And he turned his head to kiss her palm, then led her to the chairs by the fire, where they had sat countless times before. But now he drew her onto his lap instead of sitting separately, and Eleanor laughed and protested half-heartedly before settling against him, and her eyes fell on his desk where, in a place of honor, sat a small glass dome, and beneath it, perfectly preserved though faded with time, rested the single rose she had left him 5 years ago, the rose that had been her silent declaration when words had failed her. And William followed her gaze and tightened his arms around her, and he said quietly, "I keep it there to remind myself never to be blind again, never to take for granted the precious gift of your love, never to let fear prevent me from seeing what is most valuable." And Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude, of wonder at the life they had built from the ashes of loneliness. And outside the storm grew stronger, rain lashing the windows as it had on so many nights before. But inside they sat wrapped in each other's arms, two souls who had found their home in one another, and the transformation was complete. The silent companion had become the beloved wife. The frozen lord had become a devoted husband and father, and love had rewritten the story that loneliness had once penned. Dear listener, as we close this chapter of Eleanor and William's story, I invite you to consider the nature of love that exists in silence, the kind of devotion that asks nothing and expects nothing, that simply persists year after year in the shadows of another's life. For Eleanor loved William for 9 years without hope of return, 9 years during which she existed in the periphery of his world, invisible yet constant. And there is both tragedy and nobility in such love. Tragedy in the years of loneliness and unspoken longing, nobility in the purity of devotion that seeks not possession but merely proximity. Yet we must also recognize the courage required to break free from such silence, for Eleanor's decision to leave was not born of bitterness or defeat but of self-preservation, of the understanding that love which diminishes the lover is not sustainable, that to continue loving in silence was to slowly erase herself. And so she chose to walk away. And in that choice lay a different kind of courage, and the courage to value her own heart enough to seek a life beyond perpetual longing. But the story teaches us too about the greater courage still, the courage William found when confronted with loss, the courage to speak truth despite fear, to risk vulnerability despite past pain, to break through the walls he had built and declare his feelings when every instinct screamed for self-protection. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson the story offers, that love requires courage from both parties, courage to speak and courage to receive, courage to risk rejection and courage to accept devotion. And I wonder, dear listener, if there is someone in your life whose quiet presence you have taken for granted, someone who exists in your periphery, offering kindness you barely acknowledge, someone whose love or care or friendship you have overlooked because you were too afraid or too blind or too wounded to truly see them. For we are all in our ways capable of William's blindness, capable of missing what is most precious because we are trapped in our own fears and histories. And we are all capable too of Eleanor's silent suffering, of loving without speaking, of hoping without declaring, of waiting for recognition that may never come. But the story reminds us that silence, however noble, extracts a terrible price, that unspoken feelings wither in darkness, that love requires the oxygen of expression to truly flourish. And so I encourage you, if you have been holding words of love or appreciation or gratitude in your heart, to find the courage to speak them, to risk the vulnerability of honest declaration, for life is too brief and precious to waste in silence. And if you have been overlooking someone who loves you quietly, to open your eyes before departure forces recognition, to see the devotion offered before it walks away. For the greatest tragedy is not love unreturned, but love unrecognized until too late. And may Eleanor and William's story remind you that transformation is always possible, that frozen hearts can thaw, that years of loneliness can give way to profound connection, and that it is never too late to speak truth or to see clearly. and may you find the courage to both love openly and to receive love gracefully, to break through fear and reach for connection, to build a life not of silent longing, but of expressed devotion and mutual joy. And may you know peace, dear listener, the peace that comes from loving authentically and being truly seen. And may your own story, whatever chapter you find yourself in, unfold toward healing and wholeness and the kind of love that transforms loneliness into belonging. And if this tale has touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need to hear it, to subscribe to this channel for more stories of love and redemption, and to carry with you the truth that patient love, when finally acknowledged and returned, blooms with a beauty that makes every silent year worthwhile. Rest well, dear listener, and may you find the courage to speak what your heart holds in silence.